Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and community organizing socialist Kenny Cepeda. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode, and you can find us on our blog, jot down our information. Kenny, welcome back.
Yes.
Thank you. I needed a day off, and I'm ready for more.
Okay.
Kenny's been working very hard.
I mean, I think the next episode will cover as to what I've been up to and related to the pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, welcome back.
Because we need you for this topic because it's critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
That's the subject we'll be discussing today, and we'll be doing it, I guess, in 4 parts because we'll be discussing what it is, where did it come from, and where is it now, and what do we think about it. So, let's see. We'll have a lively discussion. Maybe we should start with a definition that is accepted by most scholars. So I decided just to look up the Britannica, and people can find this, and I'm just going to read off what it is. And then and then we'll discuss other parts to it. So, critical race theory is the intellectual movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. Critical race theorists hold that the law and legal institutions in the United States are inherently racist insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. Another thing that has been published by leading scholars such as Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik, Stefancic. They assert the following things. So 1, that race is socially constructed, not biologically natural. 2, racism in the United States is normal, but aberrational. It is the common, ordinary experience of most people of color. 3, owing to what critical race theorists call, in quote, interest convergence or, in quote, material determinism, legal advances or setbacks for people of color tend to serve the interest of dominant white groups. Thus, the racial hierarchy that categorizes American society may be unaffected or even reinforced by ostensible improvements in the legal status of oppressed or exploited people. 4, members of minority groups periodically undergo differential racialization or the attribution to them of variant sets of negative stereotypes, again, depending on the needs or interests of whites. And the last 2, 5, according to the thesis of intersectionality or anti-essentialism, no individual can be adequately identified by membership in a single group. An African-American person, for example, may also identify as a woman, a lesbian, a feminist, a Christian, and so on. And 6, the last one, the voice of color thesis holds that people of color are uniquely qualified to speak on behalf of other members of their group or groups regarding the forms and effects of racism. So, but those are generally what is most widely accepted as what critical race theory contends to be.
Yeah, I mean, in my research or what I was reading up, again, it's not a one thing. You know, there's different opinions as to what it is exactly. There's like, again, this is the canon, right? The Encyclopedia Britannica. But from my understanding, you know, I read from different articles, different points of view, and it's just an amalgamation of different ideas to kind of try to define, you know, the experience, I guess, of oppression of people of color. But to me, well, I found it very interesting that, I don't know if this is an opinion, but it's part of the definition or the lack of definition that it doesn't include economic factors in there as much. It's more cultural factors, yes, institutions, like the law, like perception and stuff, but it basically doesn't talk about the role of capitalism, and it lumps people together, as if all people of color are the same and have the same experiences by having, a color of skin. And so that's what I didn't find, I guess, in looking to understand what it means, because again, to me, this is also kind of new, even though once I read the definition, it started to make sense because it's very prevalent, actually. I don't think a lot of people know what CRT is, or critical race theory, but a lot of people are employing it and using it, and it's very part of the community of organizers that I'm part of in San Francisco, for example.
I just wanted to say that what it isn't, I suppose, just because I think it might be confused with, well, a lot of training and equity, diversity, and all this training that has been going on in, I think, in the police department and in schools and in workplaces. It isn't this. It's a way of thinking about the world, especially the social norms and legal practices that govern society. So it's very different from training. It's the way of thinking.
I would say that the ideas that are bound up in critical race theory from decades ago do inform the kinds of ways we talk about anti-racism and social justice and education. So I would not draw a wall between those things. I do think it informs. There is a difference between something like culturally relevant pedagogy and critical race theory, but again, even those things become somewhat informed by each other. I think the other thing I found interesting, well, first, the very notion of what is this that I didn't really know about, the idea that there was such as things called critical theory that basically said, society cannot be understood by just or understood by just looking at individuals. You had to look at the structures, the social and cultural structures in society. And so critical race theory is taking that approach of saying you have to look a little bit more at a system in play in order to understand how race and racism interacts with power. And I do think the critical race theory brings up class, but it brings it up intersectionally. That is, it brings it up as one of a series of equal divisions. I think there are problems with that, but that's one thing I thought was, well, one thing I have found. And the other thing that was interesting, which I didn't really know, is that the origins of critical race theory come out of in many ways, the failures of the civil rights movement. These people like that you had mentioned, like this guy Delgado and other Derek Bell and people like that, were all very disheartened by what had been accomplished out of the civil rights movement, and I think rightly so. Actually, I think they should be like, we didn't end racism. We didn't this did not actually address racism. In fact, there were people who saw that the Frederick, what's that, Board of Education versus Douglas versus Board of Education, saw that how whites, in their mind, how whites, but how the power structure benefited from that, and how it didn't actually lead to a rising up of the living standards of blacks. And of course, they put it in terms of whites and blacks. I would put it in terms of capitalists and worker. But I do agree the critique that it's sort of my critique of reformism is that these reforms ultimately only allowed the system to maintain itself and then actually make things worse. And this is something that, an author you've talked about, Kenny, Michelle Alexander, speaks about that. Jim Crow is formally over, but the conditions of blacks in America have gotten worse, where the United States incarcerates 25% of the global population, but only has 5% of the population, and an overwhelming percentage of that incarcerated population is black or brown people, generally black or brown workers. So, and of course, the wealth gaps and the income gaps, the wars the United States wage. I mean, the biggest thing I agree with critical race theory on is the fact that racism exists. It is institutionalized, and it is as pernicious now as it ever has been. And in that regard, I think I agree with that notion that you can't understand it as embodied in individuals. It's a systemic problem.
maybe we should discuss where is it now, because it's a very hot topic. And as you were saying, Andy, it's actually been around for, I think, 4 decades. People, I mean, it's now becoming more of a hot issue, but
Yeah.
the precursor, as you were alluding to, is was the critical legal studies, which was
Yeah,
a
I mean,
movement.
that's a good point. Like, it started really among a movement of lawyers looking at the laws and saying, just because colorblind laws will not produce colorblind outcomes, and they were trying to explain why. But again, I do think they increasingly looked at it in terms of like the problem of white supremacy, the issue of white supremacy as being the issue. That is, it was whites getting over on blacks or whites getting over on people of color. I think that to me, that led them down a road that we see today, which is what we call identity politics, and the idea that of white skin privilege, and that white workers benefit from the oppression of black and brown workers. Essentially, that's the idea.
It was also looking at not so much the right; it was looking at liberalism, because the idea in liberalism is that equality. Equality is that we don't take race into consideration, because that's the aim. We're trying to be more colorblind or more merit-based, or trying to look at people's characters, Martin Luther King would say, or as they constantly cite, and only recognizing the most overt and obvious as the racist practices. But we have seen that even that has, that even as today, as we can see, there's still dog whistle or is not so overt, subtle racist practices that are still being done institutionally. So anyhow, I'm just mentioning this point because it was originally like a criticism of liberalism. And still, if you want to take it even farther back, beyond, like, it was an offshoot as well. Like, CLS was an offshoot of Marxist-oriented critical theory, which was mostly about wealth inequality.
What's CLS? What's CLS?
It's CLS is what we were discussing, which is a critical legal studies.
Oh, okay.
Critical legal studies, what you just were talking about, and then you mentioned critical theory, which is more Marxist inspired, which it went from critical theory to critical legal studies, and then to critical theory. There's this connection. It's been offshoot after offshoot, because we were just discussing where did it come from.
I have a question. So how, Lipson, you proposed this topic, right?
Yeah.
Critical race theory. Why this topic? I mean, how did you become aware that this is becoming more, a hot topic issue? Because I have some thoughts on my own, but yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, that's your question gets to what Eduardo was asking about. Okay, what about today? I mean, there's been so much stuff going through my feed from education, websites that I'm on, about challenging and being saying, wait, we need to be able to teach critical race theory, because there are other folks who are saying what they want to ban critical race theory. Like, there's been some states, generally more in the Midwest, considered red states, where people are saying critical race theory is anti-American.
In Florida,
it's hostile to my kid, my white kid. It teaches them bad things about themselves. And there was another critique that I heard. Oh, and basically, saying it's racist, basically, because it teaches white people to be ashamed of themselves and talks about white people as oppressors. And on that basis, under the note, in many ways, it inverts some of the things that were the outcomes of the legal strategies around critical race theory that were about banning racist practices and going after hate speech and things like that, banning hate speech. The people are using that language to say, well, we will claim critical race theory is racist against whites. We want it banned on that basis. So it's sort of trying to invert it on its head, or the idea of because critical race theory does say it's not about meritocracy when you're trying to put people into jobs. It will say you actually have to look at the the situation people came from. This is affirmative action, and basically say, and use, and may in many ways just say, look, you can't just look at who is you would claim is best for the job, because that's not a colorblind thing you'll do. So you do have to look at who has got the job, and if you don't have enough people of color in particular positions, then we can say, look, this is racist. You got to do something about that. So a lot of all these things about like representation comes out of some of the critiques made by critical race theory, and these have been seen as also, these quotas are seen as racist by people on the right. So that's where it's been coming up. And so as a person who doesn't agree with the framework of critical race theory, the overall framework for challenging racism, I thought it was an interesting discussion, because I definitely don't think it should be banned. And I would say that, well, I'll say more about that maybe later, but, and two, un-American, I don't care. I mean, I don't think anybody who wants to change society should care about that. I do understand why parents feel like it's harmful to their white kid to hear, like you're an oppressor, and using identity mapping in school and dividing people up that way. And I've heard students at my own school actually talk about how they don't necessarily like it. I get it, but I understand why parents could be upset about that. But I don't think it should be banned. And it wouldn't be the way I would talk about race or racism in a class if I was teaching it. But I think it is a framework that exists, and it, at the very least, it acknowledges that we have institutional racism. But unfortunately, I think it goes about attempting to deal with institutional problems in the very way it says it shouldn't, which is it kind of asks each person to identify their own privilege or their own oppression. Like it makes you it breaks you down into an individual unit and say, well, as a white person, I have individual privilege. That acknowledgement of that, or even if it was true, doesn't change a system at all. And so the question is, well, how, if you say this is a systemic change you're trying to make, then how does that knowledge help change that system? And I don't think it does. In fact, it keeps it individualized. It makes it a guilt trip for one, and a kind of a situation for the other, of just saying, well, you're seen, which I think is important, but it doesn't change the structure that the racist structure that they actually are being raised in and live in and are going to grow up in.
I was going to say, I think we're now moving into very quickly. Oh, that's a good point as to why. And you did bring it up. So, I mean, I think where is it now? I think you did a good summary. It is. And I would also add to it the Trump layer, which is something that he had brought up in many campaigns and made it a political issue, and was a way to rally up, to stir up this division. Not just him, but other people did too on the left. And I saw it as something that was being used as a way for people to start congregating where they sort themselves. And as we have mentioned, and this has been something for the last at least 4 decades. And here we are in the Trump era that's been talking, and even in the Biden administration. And even the Biden administration has retracted about, I think they retracted something as an error of including it in some legislation around critical race theory.
Well, now the administration backtracking. A Department of Education spokesperson telling Fox News, quote, the department does not endorse the recommendations of this group, the Abolitionist Teaching Network, nor do they reflect our policy positions. It was an error in a lengthy document to include this citation.
So I think it is suddenly more in the spotlight. So I agree with you. Where we are, or what I personally think, I think that's where we're entering, because you shared some of that, is I think if people watch the last episode that we did, where I shared my COVID journey, or however anyone wants to label it, but some of the reopening school stuff and some of the stuff that we talked about, I think for me, I just tie it to the episode that we did last week, which people can find in the link in the episode notes, that it's exactly what you were talking about, which is the identity politics issue, which has to do with privilege. And I do think that people need to be seen. I think it's important, but you don't leave anything, as you were mentioning, you don't leave people with what do you do? Like, where is the labor studies movement, or where are you going to discuss how do you organize? Because if you're just going to be discussing like, oh, this is my experience, my story, and we enter into the trap of privilege, as it doesn't work, as we can clearly see my struggles in the last episode, where even as I shared and discussed the privileges I did not hold, and trying to frame it that way for my teacher friends, or even talking about privilege, about workers and the lack of solidarity that there was with workers, or even being used or not, or censoring me, as I discussed in the last episode, where people didn't really accept this brown voice telling them, this is what my community needs. We want to go back to school. This is where, whose voice is really being heard then? And where is the solidarity if we don't emphasize it on workers? And I do think that racism is obviously an issue, but I don't think that just by discussing race and discussing in loops, you're just going to end up. I don't think you're not going to be able to, cause racism to be dismantled if that's the objective.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lipson, you touched on it, that for me, identity politics, CRT, critical race theory, it has a segregating effect. When you're teaching about privilege, it not just as individuals but as groups. Segregates people in different groups, and into the most atomized way possible, because once you add intersectionality, and then the approach is to subdue your privilege, quote unquote, then it's war basically, even within the marginalized groups. Once you add the layers of sex, gender, class, all these things, it actually has a very, and I bring it. I think of BLM. When BLM happened, one of my arguments was that if people were talking about, let Black people speak. Of course, I mean, we're not trying to speak for Black people, but BLM had to grow in my mind to an issue about the institution, the system itself. But it stays segregated in that this is a Black people's fight. We're just here to support. We're just here to stand, and work as, have white people to be shields. And so we saw the result. The result was that now, BLM is in the Democratic Party. The system hasn't changed. And in fact, they're funding the police more with no response. And so, again, because no one else had a stake in it, it was just, I'm just an ally from a distance. I don't have a skin in the game. That's what I feel it does. So it has the opposite effect, of, and again, we, or at least as socialists, we see that our only weapon is to collectively, act and fight back, not as individuals. But I think this is, again, CRT is a product of an individualistic system, and it's not, in my mind, it's not an accident, because it comes from people that are, from academia, from the systems that are in place. They're not trying to destroy the system. They're just trying to reform the systems and add more people of color. But fundamentally, the system itself is discriminatory. Capitalism. It has to be. Racism is a tool of that system. That's my argument. And so again, just to paint the picture, BLM to me is a clear example of how this doesn't work. Now we don't have a response. There is that energy that could have been directed as a working class movement, because again we were deferring to, this is just a Black people's issue. It's not all of our issues. And we had episodes where we talked about why Black people matter to the ruling class. And we go back to Trump, we go back to the president. That's where it is very useful to the ruling class, whether they designed it that way or not, whether it was a product of the grassroots movements. The fact is that this CRT is divisive. It is It segregates people, even people within communities, and so and all it does is basically stay in your lane politics. There is no debate, deliberation. You just have to hear, and then we get people like Obama, people like Kamala Harris, that are cops, and the ruling class knows this. They are put in positions of power. This is colonialism. You grab people from a community to attack that community. Especially with this frame of analysis of how to fight back, which is really a reformist route, not a revolutionary one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to ask, Kenny, is your position then that this should be banned or they should not be taught in school, or?
Well, we have to teach about capitalism, in the context of racism exists. I agree with Lipson that it is important to understand that there is institutional reasons as to why racism exists. There is institutional racism. There is, mass incarceration of people of color. I think the premise of why it happens might be different. And so therefore the solution that is proposed is just a cultural solution, not a systemic solution. So it brings me to Kwame Ture. He says that, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If a white man has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Racism is not a problem of attitude, it's a problem of power. And so in the power of racism and sexism comes from capitalism, not from an attitude. And so that's the difference, that we want to change people culturally, shame people into changing their attitude, when in reality, we have to change a system. That's from the economic, and it has cultural consequences. But it's not just about, I'm going to change my attitude and that's going to change the entire system. It doesn't work like that. It hasn't worked like that. And in fact, it's producing the opposite effects of creating more division and more reactionary, racism and acts of, white people falling into their clan. And so it divides people into clans. And that is useful to the ruling class. So that's what we have to teach, I think, how it is, and we have to debate, we have to criticize these theories. But if you criticize it, we know that we live in an era that if you criticize something that comes from the left, academic left, then you're ignorant, you're a backwards person, and you must be a right winger.
Yeah, maybe Eduardo, I'm going to try to take up that question of banning, because I do think that question is an important one. Because I don't think Kenny would agree with banning CRT, but I want to speak to why not only is it the wrong thing to do, it's completely antithetical to anybody who's trying to change the world. And we'll get to that. But I do want to start from, I do believe that the reason this critical race theory is sort of being resurrected or being brought up in this way as a means of talking about the discussion around race is connected to George Floyd, is connected to what the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've already seen that movement was essentially taken over by the Democratic Party. And this is sort of the leftovers. This is now what is left over from that movement is now, okay, we're gonna give our base the idea that we support critical race theory, and the Democrats can posture as people who are fighting racism essentially by fighting for representation, which is what they've done, right? They've put representation in all the top layers, and businesses doing the same sort of thing. All those people can lay claim to being against racism because they support this element of critical race theory, which is about representation, which is about putting people of color in positions of power as a means of changing society or culture, which won't work because you're not changing the structure. But whatever, that's a critique. This is sort of like we're watching step by step the aims of that movement way back when in the summer have been chipped and etched away. And I would call this critical race theory discussion sort of the leftovers. For progressives, this is the leftovers. This is what you get now. We're not going to defund the police. You're just going to be left with maybe discussing it in campuses and then here's what happens. And this is great for the Biden administration. So the right wing comes along and says, we're going to ban that shit. Okay. Well, who is strengthened? What hand is strengthened by the power to ban this kind of stuff? The state, the very state that's going after January 6th against the extremists, against the right, that state is strengthened. So the state is strengthened, like, and those people who said, well, we want to ban hate speech and we want to ban Alex Jones, who was strengthened by that? It wasn't the right wasn't hurt by that. The left was not. I mean, the right wasn't hurt by that, and the left wasn't helped by that. The only source that was helped by that was the state, the capitalist state. So again, the House always wins on this discussion around bans. If you ban Alex Jones, or if you ban, what's left, or if you ban critical race theorists, then the only one who wins in that case is the capitalist state. Case closed, right? And so for that reason, banning should be supported on because the power the power to control who gets banned is not going to be left in the hands of those parents who don't want their kids taught certain things, or in the leftists who want to stop Muslims from being attacked. The power is going to be found in the state, the very same state which is attacking people on the border, which just bombed Somalia and is bombing the Middle East currently, right? The very same state which imprisons the highest percentage of the has the highest percentage of the population in prison, and it's mostly people of color. The very same state which is enforcing a wealth division, which is racist through and through for Black people and brown people. So that is who wins when you ban any of this stuff, when you ban the right or when you ban the left. And so the very people who are saying ban critical race theory are usually the same people who said, don't take my guns. And they don't understand, well, if you ban critical race theory, they're taking your guns next. That's how it goes, because you've just given them a tool to do it.
What is upsetting for me is that when I was going to school, I was very fortunate to have, conscientious teachers that were able to, I learned about the Holocaust. Well, that was through my Jehovah's Witness education. I learned about the Holocaust a lot sooner, because Jehovah's Witnesses were also a small percentage, but they were in concentration camps. So, but I learned about, so I did get a lot of education from conscientious teachers who were also activists, who were also in movements. So I feel like I got the seen part, like the seen or being heard of people of color being seen and heard. I did find it weird when I moved to Idaho, and I remember discussing things with my peers that they didn't know, or they weren't conscious of, or then going to Boston as well. And I stayed there for some time, and then people would say, well, I think I was already 18, 19. And people would tell me, well, I'm learning stuff that I didn't learn in school, in college. And people say that they speak about that. And I think that our US American education doesn't give a very good, for the longest time, I think hasn't been very conscientious about including the horrors of US American history, such as the massacre of native indigenous people, and also going in depth about slavery, and just also discussing it's at least I had it in my history classes, its involvement in other countries, and how hypocritical it was for the USA to be critical of so many other countries invading others when it was invading and it was colonizing other countries, and also so I think that I think when I was a kid I thought that was normal, and now I realized that people mostly learn that in higher education, or they learn that on their own, and people are suddenly more, as people are using this word woke, which I had a schema, like what is this word woke? So I think people are more conscientious today, but I do think that there is something in education that there hasn't been enough of this education, which so for me, when I think about banning or not banning, I think it's more the framework of everything that is being taught that I have an issue with, that isn't, as you also said, Angie, that isn't it's just a way to fulfill some liberal or leftist need of just, here, we'll give you this, and that's it. That's what we're doing because of what happened last year, sort of a band-aid thing. But it isn't very radical or revolutionary in its premise that I think I would like to see, because you've heard some parents say it makes them feel guilty. I've had my friend Jake, who has been here, and we've discussed things, and my friend has said that he felt guilty. Like, what does he do? Like, once I've brought up stuff like about privilege before, when I was in conversations with him about race and the whole Heather hire and what happened in Charlottesville. I mean, our discussion was just about race, guilt, privilege. It went in a loop, and I guess I didn't know where to go from there, and he was left with, what am I supposed to do with this? So there wasn't enough for us to be able to explore what that meant and how we could work together. So I think that I think is what I've seen firsthand experience to us, and it doesn't really attack what I think we should be discussing: the wealthy, the powerful, the ruling class, what is really going on here, and how institutionalized racism is a part of capitalism, and that's going to be something that we need to tackle if we want to tackle the entire thing.
Just listening from what you said, Eduardo, that you discussed with your friend,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the the outcomes, that it becomes very personal, right? Like, it's shaming. It's not really advancing or really deliberating or dissecting the issue. It just becomes an attack and a finger pointing. And then like, for me, like, as a person of color, I'm like, what the hell do I do with someone telling me that they're aware of their privilege? I mean, like, that's like telling someone, I'm sorry I have food, but I can't give it to you. Like, it just, to me, it's just optics and in sound bites, and it's just these, again, just talking and not actions, not really attacking the system that we need to destroy and take down. If we're genuinely interested in destroying, these divisions, this oppression, because I think of my situation. My landlord is a Chinese immigrant, right? Like, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean when a black cop in the city owns 4 houses, and he's renting to immigrants? What does it mean when we claim sanctuary cities, but in reality, what we're doing is just exploiting people from the South, right? We're just pretending to protect people just to bring cheap labor to San Francisco or liberal cities. Like, is that justice? Is that really advancing? Like, fighting the system? No, to me, it just reinforces the system, of exploitation and class division.
Yeah, and I mean, first, I think all of us kind of did we tried to educate ourselves a little bit about critical race theory, and we can't claim to know all the elements, particularly like the people who founded it. They talked about people like Antonio Gramsci, who is a Marxist, like a Marxist I respect. They talked about W.E.B. Du Bois. They talked about Frederick Douglass as people who are the founders of, or around which this stuff is. So do I know when they were writing those things, which would have been in the 70s and 80s, I suppose. I think that's around the time that was being written about. Do I know how they intersected class and race and things like that? I don't. But I would say that if they were citing Frederick Douglass said that the slave owner and the rulers of our world divide both whites and blacks to conquer each. And that is the talk of whites as your oppressor misdirects the idea of thinking that your oppressor is right next to you. It's the white guy next to you, or the person who is being, that it's only that person next to you, the person of color who's being oppressed. Generally, in all our classrooms, I think that we're talking about that's an entire oppressed section altogether. The whites in that room, the blacks in that room, the Asians, Latinos, whoever, all of them are generally from the working class and experiencing oppression, various levels of oppression, but all of them experiencing oppression. And the other thing that's hidden is, well, who really is the oppressor then? And that's the reason this is a problem. It's not that it makes Jake feel bad and doesn't give him anything to do, or doesn't give Kenny something to do. It's the fact that it misidentifies the actual opponent that you're dealing with. And I think it's a recipe for passivity. Do you mind if I share my screen and show you an image that I found that was okay? This is one that's currently shared. That's part of like the way that these kinds of critical race theory ideas are being brought into practice. Let me share my screen here. So this is a picture that talks about equality, if you see on the left, where you have three figures, one tall figure, medium figure, and a small figure. And then equity, which is really the critical race theory framework, or the educational framework you look about, where basically, look, this person on the left it's got a box, doesn't need it. Take that box from him, give it to that person on the right, and look what they can all do. Then they can all watch the ball game. I mean, and that really, it's that shuffling of things is sort of the way this is being talked about. Like equality isn't good enough because then you still have this person who's very small, can't see over the wall. And equity is a better way, so that the person who doesn't need the box, we can shift it over that way. I think you can see how this, if we make this person on the left a white person, right? And look, they got more than they need. Let's just take the box from them and give it over to, and then they can have something, it can lift them. But even that is really hiding the real game in play here. The ruling class steals from both groups, reshifts, and uses the theft from both groups to screw them both, to screw all of them. And if we were gonna create an accurate picture, I think we'd have to go back to this old picture right here, which is this, which paints pretty much all, and this is old, so it only has white people here, down here at the bottom, but you'd have basically whites and blacks and brown people and Asian people, all workers down here, essentially, stuck down here below, and you have an entire apparatus of the wealthy and the military and the priesthood and the politicians, and all resting on top of you with capitalism. And essentially what they've got us doing is you put whites on one side and blacks on the other side, and whites push up on one side and it pushes down on blacks, and so blacks push up back on the other side. And what it does is keeps all those folks afloat. The idea is whites and blacks working together to topple the whole darn thing, right? And so that's not how this is taught. This is not the figure that critical race theory is going to use, which is the pyramid of capitalist system. You can find it. The figure they're going to use is this, which really is passive and doesn't explain a few things. Like, doesn't explain, how did this person here on the right who's so small, how did they get small? Were they born small? Like, I assume they would say no, social forces led to that. But again, there's a lot, if you look at this kind of, and again, this is not what Derek Bell or Delgado would say, but these are the ideas, and this is how it's being talked about today, is this equality versus equity way, the equity being better. But you can see within the equity frame on the right how that can be used and how divisive that can be, and how it hides the actual system in play for a theory, critical race theory, which says it's about taking on the system. But what does this thing does? It actually hides the system and makes it seem like this is a shell game.
For me, it's like, again, we're fighting for the crumbs, and just reshuffling the crumbs off the table. And there's this movie. Maybe people want to watch it. It's a commentary kind of on this. It's called The Platform. It's on Netflix, or El Hoyo in Spanish. Basically, people in a pit, in different layers. It's a food platform that lowers, the people at the top eat first, and gradually people at the bottom don't have any food, so they have to fight and they have to climb and become, the lower on the strata you are, the more you have to fight for survival, and so again, it's a commentary on how little we really are fighting for, and pretending like that's progress and change, and that is actually challenging the system, when in fact it's just reshuffling, the crumbs that we receive, that we are left with, after we are robbed of everything we produce.
there's something that I think I'm holding on to, which is I think I don't know. I'm not able to articulate it at the moment. I do think that that have seen that images. Obviously, I've worked also in education, and it's presented in a lot in PDs. I do find it an oversimplification of how things work and function in our and when we are serving our kids, or if we're just talking about society. So I did always have issues with it because I think it oversimplifies, and I don't think it takes into consideration the other elements that you were referring to in the other image, which is the hierarchical system of capitalism. But I also know that it just for kids, sometimes I simplify it a little bit for them and just say, well, sometimes, and we're not discussing this at the moment. When I discuss when we talk about what is, why this is most appropriate, or I use the word just fair sometimes when I'm talking with little kids. So I know I've used it for those reasons, but when we're discussing whether they're adults, and we're discussing especially with higher thinking and like adolescents, and we're discussing systems, and we're discussing right now as critical race theory, which is going to be implemented, or at least it's being in discussions for California. No, I think I'm in agreement that it is quite reductive in so far as just a discussion of race. It's a loop. It just goes it's a loop and a loop and a loop and a loop, and I don't see how we will be able to free it. I personally don't see how, as a Latino person, as a person of color that understands that racism and institutionalized racism is there, and I have experienced it, or either directly or indirectly, or aware or unaware of it. I don't see how I'm just discussing about critical race theory that's going to help me or my white friends, or to be able to dismantle this. And I do believe that I would like to see a world where we are colorblind. And I did like the one part about the legal, or the framework of this, which was saying that it works on the premise that race is not natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but socially constructed. Because I do agree with that framework. That's what I do think. So it's the other stuff that I think is almost a trap, where we just stay stuck here and that's it. It's just about race, and we don't talk about worker solidarity, working groups, and how to organize. I think that is what I'm upset that this is not being included, because we really are human beings. We are, we all share, we are emotional beings. We're human. We have our feelings. We have our suffering. And race is not natural. It's not the basis of which we should be deciding how, this person or that person gets this or that, or we should be segregating ourselves, which I think is fundamentally what we're all trying to achieve. So that's the thing. I think if that's one of the bases, I'm for that. But again, I think I'm now being a broken record. It's the other pieces to it. It's like, what do we do about it? That's all my commentary of this, and I appreciate you sharing those images. I have seen those images actually, Andy. And it does oversimplify. I do think it's quite reductive.
Well, and I agree with you that it might seem like a throwaway line, like, well, how do we organize? But the reality is, I don't think you can teach about fighting racism. You have to engage in the struggle to take on the states and the institutions out of which racism is one of its fruits. It has other fruits. It has sexism and nationalism and homophobia and all sorts of ways, and vaccinated versus unvaccinated, all sorts of ways it's attempting to divide workers. All right. So it's got all these sorts of fruits. But the only way you can teach students I believe the only way you can really teach them about racism is we as adults right now to engage in the struggle against the existing state as it is. And if we're not doing that, we are teaching our students the one thing that we are supposed to teach them, which is we're teaching them obedience. and we're teaching them conformity. Even if we teach them about, oh, look at this horrible racist past, or even this horrible racist present. Again, the thing that I think is, it's not my problem with not one of my problems with that PD picture is not just it's an oversimplification, is it actually is extremely passive. It's about, how do I lift myself over the wall so I can look and see the baseball game? It has nothing to do with actually changing. If it was going to at least do this, if it was at least going to say, you have this giant weight on top of you, how do you get it off of you? What do you do? Like, are white people part of getting that weight off? Maybe they are or they are not, but allow people to at least see that they are pressed upon by institutions. That is at the heart of critical race theory, is that these institutions conform that. And that is completely gone from that. So I imagine a CRT person who was OG, original gangster, I guess, would look at this and be like, oh no, it's not, it's missing something. But nevertheless, this is the fruit that is producing today, and it's completely destructive, I would say, because it pits people against each other. It makes them fight over crumbs, and it obscures the fact that while those crumbs are being fought over, wealth is being extracted to the top. So you're actually not even gaining a crumb. You're losing whole sections of pie as you fight over a crumb that you thought you had. And again, making you think that your enemy is either the black person or the white person or the Muslim or what have you. And that's the trick that's being played on us. And there's nothing in this equity picture which shows that. But I think we have to. I believe that educators, the one thing I can say as an educator is you cannot teach the fighting of racism unless you yourself are engaged in the struggle against the state, against the institutions, and against capitalism. Otherwise, you will not, or at the very least, you are not engaged in a struggle of some sort. And if you're not engaged in a struggle, collective struggle, then you have nothing to teach our students other than what we always teach them, which is do as you're told.
And you also, on that question, Eduardo, what do we teach? I think that
if everyone look back at what I said, what do we do? I didn't say what do we teach. I just want to be clear, Andy. You also said, what do I teach? I said, what are we left with, or what do we do about it?
I want to be clear. I was agreeing with you, Eduardo. I wasn't disagreeing with you, because you had posed it as an organizing question, which is it's not a throwaway. The idea of how do we teach racism is an organizing question. It's how the way you teach about racism is fighting capitalism.
And again, my point is that at least for me, I try to just be loud and try to explain how I come to understand my own circumstances through understanding how capitalism operates, or at least in my attempts to understand how capitalism operates, because it has, that's why I am a Marxist, because it has an explanatory power as to the circumstances of my life, what got me here, why my family, they were refugees, why my dad had to fight a war, why my uncle shakes at night because of images of, people shooting while he had to sleep with a gun, why his, machismo was enhanced, and that's through this system, right? And as he becomes old, then, they become, their virility goes down, their economic power goes down, in a system that, completely dispossesses you from birth, right? Just, understanding what the hell is rent, why the hell do we pay rent, and so, again, I can only teach what I understand from myself, and then try to share my ideas that, what, you shouldn't be ashamed of yourself. You should understand why you're here. You should even white people, a lot of people were persecuted and came here fleeing the kings and queens they had. And guess what? We have kings and queens now again. We still have them. And so, again, it's just understanding your world and, understanding why your parents have to work so hard, why your school is so shitty, and how it all ties back into the same situation. And why then you're going to realize that you have more in common with that person in West Virginia that's, a white, poor person in West Virginia, than some, elite person in Miami that looks brown. And so that is what we need to be discussing, and I don't want someone to come and teach me in a theoretical way. I want to understand my circumstances, and I want to help others maybe understand their own. And so we fight, and we see that we have a common, a common mission here, a common enemy. Because otherwise it's just going to become this theoretical thing, and you're supposed to be doing this, you're supposed to be speaking that way, you're supposed to use that word. It becomes this elitist academic, shit that, it's actually very exclusive of the actual people that, we should be reaching out to. And you'd be surprised, actually, at least in my experience, the people that have gotten the shittiest deals understand capitalism more than the people that have been rewarded, have proximity to power, the academics, the people with proximity to power. Paul Hader's, kind of revised that whole 99%, framework. Like, I think that's true. It's not the 99%. We're fighting the top 20% or some shit like that, because they're not going to want to change the system. That's your Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That's your Bernie Sanders. That's your Jackie Fielder here in San Francisco. And all those liberals that adhere to reform the system and want to just shame people for not speaking a certain way. So that's not useful. Again, I want to understand my circumstances in real terms. Why my material reality is shit. Why I have to compete with other fellow coworkers. Why are we fighting for crumbs? Why are we focused on each other, pointing fingers? Well, again, the wealth keeps going up. We have undergone the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of humanity. And nothing has happened. Nothing. Not a blimp. And as much as people want to hate on Jeff Bezos, even that is problematic in my view. Because it's a system that produces those people. And if it's not Jeff Bezos, it's the next one. And I don't give a shit if it's Oprah or JC or, I always go after these people because just to make a point that I don't care about them. They don't give a shit about us. If we rise up, they're going to side with the powers that be, that to maintain the system. So they're our enemy. They're part of the ruling class.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add.
I think the only thing that I would add is, I guess I do want to put an emphasis on how do people learn something. And learning does not come from a discussion or even just reading a book. You do have to experience something. And when Eduardo, the last episode we had was about your political journey. And some of it is shaped, and I would only say a very small part of it is shaped by the discussions we've had here. The biggest part of it was shaped through your experience of trying to fight for the reopening of schools and the actual experience of the opposition you faced, and then the political questions that were raised by that. And so that is what I mean is people will not. And now, again, if we're going to learn about race and racism, we will not do it short of collective struggle. It will require that experience. None of it can be learned in a classroom. None of it can be learned by just learning a history, even as accurate a people's history as you want to make it. It has to be experienced to be truly learned. And that's what this last year of remote education was about. It's not about light hitting your eyes. You need to touch things. You need to feel things. You need to be able to experience something. And so education itself is not just little chips put in your head, which is what they're trying to make it. I do understand that they are trying to make it like little chips that they can put in and put out, and actually, in a sense, remove you from experience, and certainly and definitely remove you from a collective experience. So I want to just return to that notion of like, okay, educators, and I'm an educator, and I know Eduardo's an educator, and I hope there are people who listen to this thing. If you're an educator and you want to teach about racism or sexism, then you have to engage in struggle now, because you can't teach students about these things without us as adults engaging in struggle.
I have nothing to add. If anyone wants to add something else.
Any last things for you, Kenny?
And I did find it interesting how when you brought up this topic, I actually was reading on it, like, because it was being fed to me through the algorithms or the media, like it was on BBC, it was on the New York Times. It's like, it's very, I find it suspicious as to, like, just the block of information surrounding this specific topic, right? Like, because they were specifically talking about CRT, critical race theory. Yeah. And just maybe one last thing, I think, Lipson, you said it before that, we, these things do exist, right? Like the way we see each other, and, they're part of our society. It's not, I'm not going to pretend like it's not, an issue in the sense that people think it exists. There's clans, and we are going to have to resolve this on the way to fighting the ruling class, and we're going to have to learn to understand it in a different way. And like you said, Lipson, hopefully we can learn in the struggle, that how this is counterproductive to our common interest, to fight our common enemy. And again, it's not, I don't want people to think that it's like, no, just throw it in the back burner. No, we're going to have to address it, because it will either make us or break us.
Yeah, we'll have to address it immediately. Like, because it will be, divisions will be forged among us if we ever do try to come together. So it's not a question you can push till later, because it's going to be used to destroy the struggle and to defeat the struggle. Racism and those divisions.
Well, I was just saying quickly, not enough about classes being discussed. So that's it.
Welcome back, Kenny.
Thank you. I had energy today.
Right. I just want to be selfish for a second and just point out this wonderful book here. It's called Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, which is by Elena Garro, and it's called in English, I think, the recollections of what's to come, or the memories of the future, I think it would be. And I just had my book club earlier, so I'm still feeling very inspired by it and today. So I thought maybe I would recommend. I haven't done a recommendation of any of the books that I've been reading on this podcast for a while now. And I know your mother last time, Andy.
You liked it.
She liked it.
Yeah.
She's like, what's that book called? It's in Spanish, but they have it in English as well. And it's a Mexican female author, and she has been one of the inspirations for Gabriel Marquez Gabriel García Márquez, book, 100 años de soledad, or 100 years of solitude. Soledad.
That book is also about capitalism. 100 years of solitude.
And this one as well, actually, because it talks about after the Mexican Revolution and the military taking over this town, this pueblo. So, and just what happens, and it's just beautifully written. Right, thank you for allowing me to be selfish for a minute. Okay, here we go. What's Left is a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. I remind folks that if you like anything you have heard, please subscribe, rate, reviews, share your favorite episode to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, LBRY, LBRY, Odysee, ODYSEE, YouTube, or Telegram. And if you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with Kenny Cepeda and Andy Lipson. Thank you. See you all next time. Ciao.